Hello, everybody. Today we'll be talking about selective violence compared to indiscriminate violence and some of the wars where it was used and the effects it had. What is selective and indiscriminate violence? Selective violence is defined as entails the personalization of violence and requires info that is asymmetrically distributed between political actors and individual civilians. Indiscriminate violence is defined as violence in situations of international or internal armed conflict, which presents a serious and individual threat to civilians' life. Problems with selective violence: very information based, so area must be controlled by that actor in order for selective violence to work. Resource intensive, and it would require lots amounts of troops and structure to continue this practice. Also, it requires locals of the country to collaborate with sometimes out of state actors or against their fellow countrymen. So it's up to the locals if they would like to help or not. Problems with indiscriminate violence. Most of the time, the area is out of control, so they blindly fire into positions of civilians and military installations with no actual target. Also, when states engage in indiscriminate violence, it is highly profile. It is high profile and gets the attention of the international stage, decreasing regime legitimacy and further isolating them from the world politics. Also, firing into civilians will decrease their chance for better control and push them to the other side. Also, why states engage in selective violence. As mentioned, although very resource intensive, selective violence is often preferred by states as they can maintain control while also minimizing defectors. States rather have control over a territory and weed out those who are against them than to blindly fire into the next village, gaining more enemies and making it more difficult for future territorial gains. Also, selective violence provides structure as there is no identity problem and state actors can easily point out an enemy from a civilian. Why not use indiscriminate violence? Indiscriminate violence is a lot cheaper in terms of resources used, but why do states shy away from it? It is reported that indiscriminate fire is highly counterproductive and can result in insurgency movements and uprisings against the armed actors. Here's a quote by Matthew Kersher to support that. Civilians may participate in rebellion not in spite of risk, but in order to better manage it. So people would join the armed rebellion to fight off the indiscriminate violence committed on them. Contradicting data. Studies have shown that indiscriminate violence actually suppresses insurgency activities, with several wars to show for it. And no indiscriminate violence can also undermine an insurgency movement by the states providing goods, building infrastructure, and creating education, which is actually what the U.S. did in its invasion of Afghanistan. And also, selective violence, although used when a territory is under control, it does not guarantee that the state will hold that position always. Looking into the Afghanistan example, we can see on the left the Soviet Union's invasion and on the right the US invasion and the territory that they held at the time. On the right, we can see that the US only held the top right blue portion of the country, and when the USSR invaded, it only held the darker gray area of the country. And both engage in very different tactics. The USSR engaged in indiscriminate violence, firing into villages that are more rural and hard to get at. And the US decided to participate in selective violence and use local informants to help weed out those who are against their change. And we can see just how that worked out in this next map. On the left, we can see the USSR major bases and establishments they were able to put. And on the right, we could see the US's bases and major establishments. And in comparison, we can see that the US was able to place several more and hold more ground. The yellow darker areas is places where the Taliban is still more prevalent. We could see that most of the country had been eradicated of the Taliban by then. Um, in comparison, the USSR on the left used indiscriminate violence, resulting in insurgency uprisings and people wanting them out of their country as they were seen as invaders. And the US was not seen as invaders. In fact, they were seen as liberators from the Taliban oppressive rule. Some of the failures in Afghanistan. As mentioned before, indiscriminate violence is not resource intensive, so only 30,000 Soviet troops were sent into Afghanistan to secure Kabul, but the Mujahideen still controlled 80% of the country. Because of the guerrilla warfare and insurgents attacking them, the USSR used indiscriminate violence to power through the country, but after the cost of 25,000 of their men and losing the fight. In comparison, the U.S. at the peak had over 120,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, controlling most of the country using selective violence, but in the end handed it back over to the ANA, or Afghan National Army. Here we see two wars that the USSR, which is now Russia, and the United States both participated in, but under different circumstances, but both use indiscriminate violence. In the left, we can see that South Vietnam had been dealing with an insurgency problem, and the U.S. was sent in to stop and eradicate it. And on the right, we could see that Russia invaded Chechnya from all sides, using indiscriminate violence to gain way through the country. Both sides used indiscriminate violence, but with severely different outcomes to the wars. Various variables. Russia entered Chechnya with 40,000 troops twice, and both wars the Russians used indiscriminate violence, while also suppressing insurgent uprisings. Ultimately, the Russians accomplished their goals by adding Chechnya to their federation. In comparison, the U.S. had sent 2.7 million troops into Vietnam throughout the decade they fought there, but the military participated in indiscriminate violence, as mentioned before, and because of this, the Viet Cong, a guerrilla force, had risen to power and started infiltrating the South and attacking U.S. positions, ultimately leading them to pull out of the country entirely. Conclusion, it is often depending on the type of war and military strategy if a state acts on indiscriminate violence or selective violence. It is often up to public opinion. It is important because often out-of-state forces are looked at as invaders, and wars and conflicts have several different variables and situations that all contribute to whether or not selective or indiscriminate violence works and the consequences that come along with it.